gentleman come in, and he went to sit down doing prayer, and he sat there for a few minutes, and then after prayer, he got up, and he went back in our pastor's office, and then I heard two shots. It wasn't a minute, and I heard two shots, and so I just got everybody out of the church. And we just kept hearing shooting, bang, bang, bang.
He had just stepped away from the pulpit. The prayer was over. The music was rising, and people were still in their seats, until two shots rang out, then another, and then one final blast that made someone scream out his name. In the back office behind the sanctuary, a man stood holding a handgun, but he didn't say a word, and he didn't try to run. People began to shout. Some dropped to the floor, and others scrambled toward the exits. There was confusion, panic, and disbelief, because they knew what they had just heard, but they couldn't believe where they were hearing it. This is a church, and that was their pastor, a man they had known for decades, a man who married their children, buried their parents, and preached forgiveness every Sunday. Now he was lying face down on the carpet of his office. The shooter? He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a thief, or a man with a vendetta against the church. He was family, and he was the pastor's own brother. And what no one knew, not then, not in those first horrible minutes, was that this shooting didn't start with a gun. It didn't start that morning. This was a tragedy nearly 50 years in the making. A quiet, bitter unraveling, built on untreated illness, old resentments, and warning signs that were seen, documented, and ignored. This wasn't just a murder, it was a collapse of a man, of system, and of a bond that no one thought could break. But long before the church office turned into a crime scene, before his name made the headlines, and before anyone ever called him Reverend, there was simply William. He was born in 1945 in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where roots ran deep and community still meant something. His family was large, tight-knit, and full of voices that sang, prayed, and argued under the same roof. William grew up with 12 siblings, and even then, people said he had a quiet strength to him. He wasn't the loudest, but you noticed when he entered a room. In 1963, he graduated from Dunbar High School, the kind of graduate people remembered because he carried himself like he had somewhere to be. And he did. Not long after graduation, William enlisted in the United States Army. He was deployed to Vietnam, a war that took so many, changed even more, and left very few untouched. But William came back different than most, not bitter, not broken but reflective. He returned to Dayton wearing a Bronze Star, a medal awarded for acts of heroism, but it wasn't the kind of honor he ever used to elevate himself. In fact, he rarely talked about it. J.E. didn't brag. He didn't even volunteer the story unless someone asked. And even then, he'd shift the conversation back to you. Because William didn't run from duty, he just changed battlefields. After the war, he walked straight into education, not just as a job, but as a calling. He began teaching in Dayton public schools, where he quickly became known for his calm presence and firm but compassionate leadership. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a mentor. He remembered students' names, looked them in the eye, and asked how their parents were doing. And he meant it. Eventually, he became principal in Jefferson Township, where he served for nearly 20 years. 2 decades of shaping young minds, helping struggling families, and never once raising his voice to prove a point. He didn't need to. William's authority came from respect, not fear. He retired from education in 1997, but only on paper. Because in truth, he never stopped teaching. He just changed classrooms. That same year, he stepped fully into his ministry. William had always been active in his church, but now he poured everything into it. He became the pastor of St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church, the same church his father once led, and under his leadership, it grew not just in size, but in spirit. His sermons weren't flashy. They didn't need to be. He spoke with a grounded wisdom, the kind that comes from experience, not performance. And he had a way of connecting scripture to the world people actually lived in. One day, while preaching about the distractions of modern life, he held up a Bible and said, "On Facebook, you look for likes. In this book, you look for love."
See, on Facebook, you look for likes. In this book here called the Bible, you look for love.
That was William, rooted, steady, and able to cut through noise. with one sentence. But his leadership didn't stop at the church doors. He served as the interim president of the Dayton School Board and as president of the local Baptist Ministers Union, a position that brought together leaders from all over the city. He was also a trained mediator for the city of Dayton, someone people called when things got heated, because they knew William could bring the temperature down without picking sides. It was Saturday, February 27th, 2016, the kind of day William B. Schooler had lived many times before. His weekend was like most weekends, quiet, purposeful, structured. The church was in order, the sermon was ready, and Sunday morning was just hours away. That evening, William had a conversation that seemed, at the time, like just another part of his steady rhythm of service. He was on the phone with Dayton City Commissioner Joey Williams, a man he had worked with for years on community matters. The topic, once again, was youth violence. It was a cause William never let go of. Not when he retired from schools, not when he moved fully into ministry, and certainly not now. They spoke about solutions, real ones. Not just talk, but action. How do we stop young men from picking up guns? How do we give them hope, direction, something to believe in? William was still asking those questions, even after decades of public service. He hadn't grown cynical. He hadn't burned out. In fact, Joey would later say William was hopeful that evening. He was calm, focused, and determined. He believed that change was still possible. He had plans, new strategies and ideas to share with the congregation, maybe even community programs to revive. And after he hung up that call, he likely sat back in his chair, closed his notes for tomorrow's service, and thanked God for the opportunity to lead one more Sunday. There was no way for him to know that the violence he was trying to stop, the chaos he had spent years trying to keep outside the walls of his church, was already on its way inside, because the very next morning, the very thing he fought against came to find him. Sunday morning, February 28th, 2016, began like so many before it at St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church in Dayton, Ohio. William B. Schooler had led this church with calm authority for years, and this morning, like every Sunday, he stood at the front, measured, composed, and ready to begin the service. The choir sang, the congregation rose in praise, and William opened with prayer. His voice was steady, deep, and familiar, anchoring the room with the same reassuring cadence he'd carried for decades. And then, quietly, a man entered from the back. He simply found a seat toward the rear of the sanctuary and lowered his head as the prayer continued. It was Daniel Schooler, William's younger brother. Eyewitness Beulah Booker Robinson later recalled it clearly. He came in during prayer, sat down. After the offering, he got up and went to the pastor's office. At that moment, nothing about Daniel's behavior raised an alarm. He moved slowly, deliberately, not with panic or anger, but with a calmness that, in hindsight, would haunt those who saw it. The shots rang out fast. Two at first sharp, unmistakable cracks that cut through the music, like glass breaking in a quiet room. People didn't know where to go. Some grabbed children. Others reached for loved ones. A few headed toward the back of the church, hoping to help, unsure of what they'd find. Inside the pastor's office, just steps behind the pulpit, the violence had unfolded in seconds. Daniel had walked in and drawn a handgun. There were no words exchanged, no warnings. He fired again and again, until the only sound left was his older brother's wife screaming. By the time the 911 calls began pouring in, the panic inside St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church had already reached its peak. Officers were dispatched immediately, and because it was classified as an active shooter situation, they didn't wait. They moved fast, armed, alert, and ready to face the worst. The church building, usually a refuge for peace and prayer, was now cordoned off like a crime scene. Yellow tape, bulletproof vests, drawn weapons, the kind of images that didn't belong in a place like this. But this was no drill, and the information they had was sparse. Someone had been shot, the gunman was still inside, and there might be more victims. So they entered with caution, their formation tight, every step calculated. They didn't know what they'd find around the next corner, only that they had to move quickly. But what they found wasn't what they expected. Daniel Schooler was still there. He stood just outside his brother's office, in the same quiet posture he'd entered with, his hands still, and when officers approached him, he offered no resistance. He was arrested on the spot, handcuffed, and walked out of the church without a single word. Inside the office, they found William B. Schooler lying on the floor.
Wasn't somewhat of an active shooter. The officers did exactly what they were trained to do. They knew there was a shooter inside.
Police say the accused shooter, Daniel Schooler, knew the victim, his brother.
The paramedics did what they could, but there was nothing left to save. The pastor had died at the scene, shot multiple times, in the very room where he had once offered counsel, comfort, and prayer. And as the body was covered and Daniel was led away in silence, there was still one question that no one could answer. Why? Why would a man shoot his own brother?
Inside the church, Pastor Schooler was dead. Outside, his brother Daniel, handcuffed, led off by police.
We're just in shock. We could not have seen this coming.
Daniel and William were two of 13 siblings, a large family.
I love both of my uncles.
A family tonight both grieving and asking that one question, why?
I love both of them. No matter what, I love both of them. And we stick together. We're family, and we'll stick together.
The crowd that gathered outside couldn't make sense of it. Members of the church stood behind the tape, clutching coats and tissues, eyes wide with disbelief.
I can't believe it.
It was awful. It was awful.
He just told me today, Sister McGraw, I'm proud of you. Get yourself together and, continue doing God's work.
I got a call from my daughter. That part is very hard to talk about.
The scene had been cleared, the shooter taken into custody, and the body of Reverend William B. Schooler removed from the church he had served for nearly 2 decades. But for investigators, the real work had only just begun. Detectives with the Dayton Police Department began piecing together what had led to the shooting, because this wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't impulsive. There was something deeper here, something older. So they went back. They combed through records, court documents, and family histories. And quickly, a troubling pattern began to surface. Before the headlines, before the gunfire, before anyone imagined such a tragedy could happen, there was just Daniel. Daniel Gregory Schooler was the youngest of the Schooler brothers. He had grown up in the same Dayton neighborhood as William, walked the same streets, and sat in the same church pews. And for a time, the bond between them was solid. 2 sons were raised in a home of faith and discipline. 2 brothers who shared the same bloodline and Sunday traditions. But over the years, something shifted. Daniel had been diagnosed with both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, conditions that, if untreated, could fracture reality and alter perception. And for Daniel, that's exactly what they did. He was known to be calm one day, unpredictable the next. And when he failed to take his medication, the consequences were often violent. In 2001, Daniel shot his own nephew. It wasn't a warning shot or an accident. It was deliberate. But no charges were pressed. The family handled it quietly, internally. Still, it was the first major signal that something was seriously wrong. Then, in 2002, things escalated. A woman visiting Daniel's home endured a 40-minute attack that left her beaten, bitten, choked, and cut with a knife. It was brutal. The assault was sustained, and when officers arrived, they saw the kind of damage that pointed to more than just anger. Daniel was charged with felonious assault using a deadly weapon and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But even during court proceedings, the concern wasn't just about violence. It was about mental health. A court document stated clearly, Daniel may be mentally ill and in need of treatment. That observation wasn't new. It had followed him for years. In 2007, he struck a man in the face with a golf club, completely unprovoked. And in 2008, 2 men told police that Daniel had thrown a hammer at them and then chased them with a 6-inch knife. No one was killed, but the pattern was clear. When Daniel's medication stopped, his behavior turned dangerous. He wasn't just battling an internal illness. He was slipping through the cracks of a system that failed to intervene. And yet, despite multiple arrests and red flags, Daniel remained in the community, untreated and largely unsupervised. Then came the lawsuit. In 2011, Daniel filed a civil suit against William and several church leaders. The case centered around inheritance, church property, and a piece of real estate that Daniel believed he was entitled to. The court reviewed the claims and dismissed the case, citing lack of evidence. But the damage was already done. It wasn't just a legal grievance, it was a personal break. What began as tension over family money began to fester into resentment. Joyce Napier, the niece of both men, later spoke about the shift she witnessed over the years. She remembered the kindness they were raised with, the deep family values rooted in love, not division. But with Daniel, she said something changed. We were raised to love, but something changed in Daniel's head. And by 2016, that change had reached a dangerous silence. There were no more legal motions filed, no more confrontations anyone could recall. On the surface, things had gone quiet, but the anger, the mental strain, the unresolved fractures between the brothers, they hadn't gone away. By 2016, the tension had gone silent, but it hasn't gone away. Montgomery County Prosecutor Matt Heck Jr. stood before the press and addressed the public with grim resolve. This was a tragic and senseless shooting. But beyond the public grief, there were legal consequences. Serious ones. Daniel Schooler was charged with 3 counts of murder, not manslaughter, not negligent homicide. Murder, premeditated and personal. He was also hit with 2 counts of felonious assault and 2 counts of possessing weapons while under disability, meaning he was not legally permitted to own or carry a firearm due to his mental health status and prior convictions. But somehow, he had still obtained a gun. And now a man is dead. His defense team quickly raised the question many were already thinking. Was Daniel even fit to stand trial? He had been silent during the arrest, passive in the courtroom. He barely responded during arraignment, and appeared disconnected from the gravity of the charges against him. His history, they argued, was enough to warrant a full mental health evaluation. So the court ordered it multiple times. For weeks, Daniel was evaluated by forensic psychologists. They reviewed his criminal record, psychiatric reports, prior incarcerations, and personal interviews. The assessments were thorough, and no detail was overlooked. The court needed to determine whether he understood the charges against him, whether he could assist in his own defense, and whether he could be held accountable for the death of his brother. After several evaluations and deliberations, the verdict came in. Daniel Schooler, despite his history of mental illness, was found competent to stand trial. He would face the charges in full. 5 days after the shooting, the city gathered to say goodbye. The funeral was held at Omega Baptist Church, one of the largest congregations in Dayton. The sanctuary filled quickly, then the balcony, then the fellowship hall still. People kept arriving. There were politicians, students, teachers, and fellow pastors. There were families he had counseled, children he had mentored, and strangers who had only known him from the way he walked through their neighborhood. His death had drawn them all together, not in silence, but in a collective grief that rang loud in prayer and song. The service began with gospel hymns, hands raised, voices trembling. Some wept openly. Others stood quietly, still stunned by what had happened. Speaker after speaker took the podium, not to summarize his life, but to testify to its reach. They spoke of his calm presence, his refusal to give up on young men others had written off, and his quiet but firm leadership through some of Dayton's darkest seasons. A former student described him as the first adult who truly listened. A pastor remembered the way William mediated church conflicts without ever choosing sides. And an elected official admitted that most of her best community initiatives had started with conversations in his office. Outside, candles flickered on the steps of the church. Local clergy held vigils in his name, and news cameras caught sight of hand-painted posters with words like, "We lost a giant," and "Violence stole a peacemaker." But even amid the mourning, questions were rising. How had a man with such a documented history of violence and severe mental illness managed to walk into a church with a handgun? Why hadn't the legal system, with its many warnings and past cases, stopped him? The Community Progress Institute of Dayton issued a public statement that echoed what many were already asking. How does a man with this history still get a gun? It wasn't rhetorical. The city was mourning, but it was also awakening. In community halls and on radio shows, the conversation shifted. The tragedy had exposed more than grief. It had exposed a system that had failed on every level. People began calling for change. They demanded stricter regulations on gun ownership for individuals with violent psychiatric histories. They demanded real access to mental health services, especially in underserved black communities. They demanded a review of court decisions that had repeatedly released Daniel Schooler without enforced treatment. And they called for deeper healing, not just for the family, but for the neighborhoods who saw in William Schooler something they rarely found in positions of power, a man who showed up and stayed. The funeral didn't end the pain, but it lit a fire. And as the final prayer was spoken and the choir began its last song, the city understood that the next chapter wouldn't be written by Reverend Schooler, but because of him. So what do you think about this case? Was there a moment where someone could have stepped in? Could any of this have been prevented? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories that go deeper than headlines and ask harder questions, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that don't just tell what happened, but explore why. We'll see you in the next one.